A History of Southern Missouri and Northern Arkansas by William Monks, published in 1907. Give an Oyster Supper. In April 1864, the author had promised to return to Raleigh for the purpose of aiding and recruiting a regiment known as the 16th Missouri Cavalry Volunteer. He informed the commander and asked for his recommendation, which was granted. He wanted to know when I wanted to start so that he could make preparations to send me around by water. The author informed him that he intended to march through by land. The commander thought it was a thing impossible that scouting bands of rebels had possession of the country from a short distance outside of Batesville almost to Raleigh, Missouri. The commander and provost marshal gave the author an innovation, made an oyster supper for him and his company of scouts, said they were loath to give them up, that they had performed so much valuable service, and he didn't know where he could get any other men to take their places. After taking leave of the officers and soldiers, the author took a small flag fastened upon a staff, fastened it to the brow band of the bridle, and remarked to the officers as he bid them goodbye that the stars and stripes should float from Batesville to Raleigh, or the author would die in the attempt. The company then set out for Raleigh, Missouri. Colonel Woods of the 11th Missouri Cavalry had been on detached service, and Lieutenant Colonel Stevens had been commanding the regiment. He had received orders to join his regiment at Batesville, Arkansas, and, with a considerable force of men, reached the state line about 12 o'clock and came in sight of the command. They saw our company approaching, at once drew up in line of battle, and as many of the rebels had procured Federal uniforms, both parties set out curious to ascertain who the forces were. On learning that both sides were Federals, we marched up and went into camp with them. The author was immediately taken to Colonel Wood's headquarters. He informed him that he had camped near West Plains the night before, and that the bushwhackers had kept up a continuous fire until after they got a considerable distance down South Fork, and he believed it impossible for as small a force as I had to reach Raleigh without great disaster and perhaps annihilation. He said that the author and his company of scouts were the very men he wanted, and offered to increase his salary to $7 per day if he would go back with him and remain with his command. The author told him that he was honor bound to return to Missouri and assist in organizing a regiment of cavalry for the United States service, and if the bushwhackers didn't keep clear, he would give some of them a furlough before he reached Raleigh. After dinner, Woods broke camp and moved in the direction of Batesville, and we in the direction of Raleigh. Near where the last firing was done, they had arrested a man named Cross, who really was a Union man, and the author had been well acquainted with him before the war commenced. But Wood's soldiers could with difficulty be restrained from shooting him. On my informing the colonel that I was well acquainted with the man and that there was no harm in him, he agreed to turn him over to the author and let him bring him back home with him. After we had started, Cross informed the author that he knew the parties who had been firing on the Federal troops, that their headquarters were about 2 miles from where he then resided, and that he was satisfied from the last firing he had heard that they had turned off from the main road and gone up what was called the Newberry Hollow. After passing the old Newberry farm, they had a plain trail that turned to the right and led directly to the camp. They were commanded by 2 men named Hawkins and Yates. On reaching his house, he agreed to continue with us to the road he thought they had gone and then return home. I think he was the happiest man I ever saw when he found he had been turned over to my care, believing that Wood's command intended to shoot him. On reaching the road, we found a fresh rebel trail leading right up to the creek. We moved on until near the Newberry residence, which we had been informed by Cross was occupied by Hawkins' wife. We turned from the road and halted, and the author, with 2 or 3 of his men being familiar with the country, reached a high point from which we could distinctly see one horse standing at the door. Supposing the rebel scouts were all there, we went back to the company, moved cautiously toward the house, and gave orders to charge upon them as soon as our approach was discovered. On coming within 50 yards of the house, which was unenclosed, a woman stepped outside the door, looked toward us, and then wheeled for the house, and we charged. Hawkins' horse was hitched to a half of a horseshoe driven in at the side of the door, the bridle rein looped over it, his halter rein being already tied over the saddle horn. The author had ordered all to charge with pistols in hand. As Hawkins reached the door and made an attempt to take his bridle rein, he saw that it was impossible. The author demanded his surrender. He attempted to draw his pistol and had it halfway out of its holster and cocked. When the author fired upon him, he fell back, still holding his pistol. The author, supposing more of the enemy were inside the house, dismounted and, rushing to the door, demanded the surrender of every person that might be in the house. As the author entered the door, he heard Hawkins, still holding his pistol, remark, "Monks, you have killed me." The author replied that that was what he intended to do, and he must let go of that pistol or he would be shot again. He took his hand loose from the pistol and in a short time was dead. His wife asked the author to lay him out, which request was complied with. We mounted and again took the rebel trail, and by this time it had grown so dark that we lost it and went on to the residence of Captain Howard, dismounted, fed our horses, and got our supper. Captain Howard afterwards informed the author that he had just been home and started back to the rebel camp and heard the horse's feet, stepped behind a tree, and that we passed within 15 feet of him. Said if it hadn't been dark, we would have been certain to have found the rebel camp, that day some one of the rebel soldiers had killed a deer, stretched the skin, and had it hanging up, and the camp wasn't more than 200 yards from the main road. After we ate our suppers and fed our horses, we again resumed our march and reached Rolla, Missouri, on the second day afterwards.